Hello, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon or good evening to those of you joining from other time zones. I know that given the regional focus of this report, we've got quite the international audience. My name is Adrian Shahbaz. I'm the Vice President for Research and Analysis at Freedom House. And I just wanted to thank you for joining us for the launch of Nations in Transit 2023. For 25 years, Freedom House has published this annual report on the health of democracy in 29 countries from Central Europe to Central Asia. And for those of you who don't know Freedom House, we are a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization with a mission to expand and defend freedom around the world. We're the oldest pro-democracy organization in America, having been founded in 1941. And today we have an international staff devoted to informing the world about emerging threats to freedom, mobilizing decision makers to respond to authoritarian threats, and providing direct support to the courageous activists and organizations that are driving pro-democracy movements and protecting people's human rights around the world. This year's edition of Nations in Transit is titled War Deepens a Regional Divide. And the findings underscore what Freedom House has known since our founding during World War II. Threats to freedom and democracy cannot be contained by borders. What happens in one country can have ripple effects that not only damage regional stability, but that can also alter the course of events half a world away. The Russian regime's illegal, unprovoked, full-scale invasion of Ukraine drove a 19th consecutive year of decline in democratic governance in the region and continued to sow instability in global food and energy markets. We'll hear about the devastating impact of the war on human rights in Ukraine and the spillover effects for freedom and democratic activism in the region. But there are also some reasons to be hopeful, some signs of democratic resilience amid the chaos. I'm heartened by the solidarity that democracies have shown with the cause of Ukrainian freedom, but it will take sustained, decisive, and unified action to stem the authoritarian tide and help this once promising region get back on the democratic path. There is so much work to do, but I'm hopeful that if we continue to push for democracy and human rights to be at the heart of our understanding of national security and foreign policy, we'll have better news to report in the coming years. Before we get to our great program, I want to first acknowledge and thank the U.S. Agency for International Development for their longstanding support of the Nations in Transit project. Without their commitment, we would simply not be here today. I also want to thank the Dutch Postcode Lottery, the John B. Herford Foundation, the Jillens Posten Foundation, and the Jillens Posten Foundation for supporting our research. We have a great event in store for you today. First, we're very fortunate to be joined for opening remarks by USAID Senior Deputy Assistant Administrator, Lisa Magno. Then report author Mike Smeltzer will walk us through the findings of Nations in Transit 2023. And we'll round out the session with a discussion among our distinguished panel, including some audience questions. So one housekeeping note on that note, just before we get started, please use the Q&A function on Zoom to submit any questions that you may have for our panelists. We'll get to as many as possible with our remaining time at the end. And we also encourage you to ask questions and join the conversation on social media using the hashtag #NationsInTransit. Now, let me introduce our distinguished guest speaker. Since 2021, Lisa Magno has been Senior Deputy Assistant Administrator in the Bureau for Europe and Eurasia at USAID. Throughout 30 years of working at USAID, Ms. Magno has worked in USAID missions to Kosovo, Afghanistan, Guatemala, the Philippines, and Colombia, and as Chief Strategic Planning Officer in the Bureau of Asia and Middle East in Washington, D.C. We're so grateful that she has taken the time to join us today to help launch this edition of Nations in Transit, a region that she knows very well. Ms. Magno, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Adrian, and welcome. Good morning from Washington, D.C. Since the 1990s, Freedom House has provided detailed and rigorous evaluation of the state of democracy in the region, stretching from Central Europe to Central Asia through its Nations in Transit report supported by USAID. For all 29 countries in Nations in Transit, Freedom House, in consultation with the report authors, a panel of expert advisors, and a group of regional reviewers, provides numerical ratings in 7 categories that broadly represent the institutional underpinnings of liberal democracy. No other report that I am aware of can match the depth or the longevity of NIT's tracking of these trends. In this era of manipulating information for foreign policy or partisan political gain, the careful analysis and reliability of Freedom House reports and scores over decades provides a North Star in orienting our thinking about democratic progress or backsliding in the region. USAID deeply values critical analysis that are based on solid evidence and credible research. USAID funded this report and supports other such research and analysis to help us all have a better understanding of progress on democratization in Europe and Eurasia, and to add to the conversation among key stakeholders, including the governments themselves, about trends and progress in the region. You may or may not concur with the findings and conclusions of this report, and I want to underscore that consensus is not the point here. Rather, USAID seeks to lay out data as a starting point for discussion and dialogue. As such, our partner Freedom House and the expert panel assembled this morning will dive into the report's findings that democracy remains under threat and a robust, coordinated response is essential. We know the audience here is eager to hear new analysis that reveal trends and have policy and political implications. USAID and our partner Freedom House welcome serious inquiry and reasoned debate that helps us better evaluate the state of democracy in the region. Key findings from this year's report correlate strongly with what we at USAID have seen and experienced on the ground. 1, overall democratic governance in the region suffered a decline for the 19th year in a row. As Moscow pursued its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, autocrats persisted in their domestic assault on the remaining vestiges of institutional independence in the media, local governance, and especially civil society. Per the report, democracy scores declined in 11 out of the 29 countries. Yet, civic activists and democratic leaders continued to strive for better governance across the diverse region, and 7 countries actually earned improvements. Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine and the further deepening of its autocracy at home has destabilized the region and heightened the sense of danger from the Kremlin's authoritarian aggression. It has shattered any lingering belief among democracies that forging strong economic bonds and minimizing criticism on human rights issues could mitigate the threat posed by authoritarian neighbors. As Ukrainians make tremendous sacrifices to ensure that their children can live in a Europe and a world free from the fear of dictators, the corruption of oligarchs, and the deception of propagandists, it is up to Ukraine's democratic partners to ensure that these sacrifices are not wasted. Russia's war against Ukraine is an existential threat to the global world order, stemming from a completely unprovoked attack on an independent nation's sovereignty. And left unanswered, Russia's heinous actions against another sovereign nation threatens us all by emboldening bad actors and unscrupulous states to act with aggression and impunity. Therefore, US leadership has rallied allies such as the European Union, Japan, and Canada, which similarly assess the Kremlin's actions as unacceptable and provided budget support, humanitarian, and development assistance. Elsewhere in Europe and Eurasia, European Union member states pursued diverging paths on illiberal populism. European democratic standards continue to be challenged internally and externally. And yet, there are signs of hope, with voters repudiating populist illiberal leaders in the past year. These positive developments are serving as a reminder of democracy's inherent potential for self-correction. Autocratic governments sunk further in a downward spiral of repression and instability. Of the 8 countries classified as consolidated authoritarian regimes, 6 suffered further declines in their already abysmal democracy scores. The Nations in Transit report found that while democracy continues to face major setbacks and headwinds, there are countries which have demonstrated resilience and opportunity and provide real grounds for optimism. Let me cite just one very recent example. The large rally this past weekend in Moldova in support of that country's European path shows that citizens' interests can find expression in their leaders and their institutions, even in the face of political polarization, malign foreign influence, and war in the region. USAID continues to find and use these opportunities to bolster democratic resilience. As USAID Administrator Samantha Power noted, and I quote, "Citizens need to trust their leaders and their institutions. They need to see and experience the power of democracy to meet their needs. This trust must be built in some cases, or in other cases, it must be rebuilt, having been squandered or again besieged." End of quote. At the 2023 Summit for Democracy just over a month ago, President Biden told us that we're at an inflection point in history here, where the decisions we make today are going to affect the course of our world for the next several decades, for certain. And nothing else proves the point about our pivotal times that Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, which is testing not only common notions of sovereignty, but also democracy itself. The Nations in Transit report provides us the analysis and guidance we need to understand democratization and make key judgments and decisions better for ourselves, our allies, and our world. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ms. Magno, for the very sobering and I think grounding opening remarks here and for your leadership on these issues in this region throughout your career. I'm very pleased to introduce my friend and colleague, Mike Smeltzer, the author of Nations in Transit, to walk us through this year's findings. So over to you, Mike.
Thank you, Adrian, for kicking us off. And thank you, of course, to Senior Deputy Assistant Administrator Magno for that wonderful introduction. And of course, for USAID's generous support of this report. I also want to acknowledge the work of my colleagues at Freedom House, most of all, Alexandra Karpy, who is our research analyst on NIT and has been absolutely instrumental in making this report happen. And lastly, I'd like to extend our deepest thanks to our country experts, regional advisors, and external reviewers for their contributions, without which this report simply would not be possible. So before we get to the findings of this year's report, I really want to take a moment to describe and go back into the nature of this research that we do at Freedom House. Now, Nations in Transit is Freedom House's annual report that focuses on democracy in this region stretching from Central Europe to Central Asia. And in this research, we focus on the institutional factors of democratic resilience. That is, how a country's institutions are serving, protecting, and guaranteeing those rights examined in our other report, Freedom in the World. And then based on this analysis of these institutions, we categorize countries as one of 5 regime types, ranging from the consolidated democracies, the green on the map that you see here, to the consolidated authoritarian regimes, the purple that you see on the map here. Now, last year's report, Nations in Transit 2022, this came out 2 months after the start of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And in those 2 months between the start of Russia's onslaught and the publication of our report, we had many questions about what the impact of the Kremlin's war would be on the region's democratic trajectory. Many of us hoped that Ukrainians' heroic defense against authoritarian aggression would really galvanize democracy's supporters throughout Europe and Eurasia. Well, the findings of Nations in Transit 2023 finds that the reality is somewhat more complex and somewhere in the middle. As Adrian mentioned at the top, this report documents the 19th consecutive year of democratic decline across this region as a whole. Of the 29 countries in this report in 2022, 11 experienced declines in their democracy scores while 7 improved. But this figure really obscures an important development about the status of democracy, democratic institutions, and their trajectory across this region. In fact, the majority of the declines were situated in the already authoritarian environments of Eurasia, while the scores in Central and Eastern Europe and the Caucasus were more often than not stable, if not slightly improving. And so there's this really important institutional and democratic divide happening in this region. Now let's dig into what this means by per country. So let's start with an examination of the 11 EU member states analyzed in this report. Now 10 of the 11 are either consolidated or semi-consolidated democracies. The one outlier is Hungary, which in recent years has been classified in this report as a hybrid regime. That is a country where it's between democracy and autocracy. And overall, these 11 EU member states saw the smallest aggregate decline in democratic governance since 2010. That is no small feat. On the positive note, the defeat of populist and illiberal leaders in Slovenia in 2022 and Czechia earlier this year, again, served as a reminder of democracy's inherent potential for self-correction through elections. On the other hand, we saw political dysfunction continue in Slovakia and Bulgaria and Romania, where this system of stable instability continued apace. Now, the bloc's ability to pull together and support Ukraine's war effort was remarkable in many respects. But perhaps one of the most interesting developments was the foreign policy rift that emerged between the governments in Warsaw and Budapest. Poland continues to be one of Ukraine's most ardent supporters, while Hungary eschews broader EU solidarity with the victim in this war. Still, though, it's important to note that this emerging crack in their relations, it shouldn't make us lose sight of the serious damage done to the democratic institutions and human rights in both of these countries during the current ruling party's tenures. Now let's turn to the 10 non-EU states of Eastern Europe, the South Caucasus, and the Western Balkans. These are all hybrid regimes, and this group really exhibited a mix of progress and setbacks in the last year. Ukraine, Moldova, and Armenia, they have all steadily improved in their democratic institutions in recent years, driven forward by civic activism and consequential elections. And even as authoritarian aggression has threatened their basic security, the people in these countries and their freely elected leaders have fought to improve governance, improve democratic governance through close collaboration with local NGOs and experts. And importantly, the Ukrainian government generally rejected this notion that political rights and civil liberties can be cast aside during wartime, which of course is the polar opposite to the approach that the Kremlin has taken in Russia, but we'll get to that story. In Georgia, the country's toxic political polarization has really seeped into every public institution. And earlier this year, we saw how the government proposed a Russian-style foreign agents law, which would have forced local NGOs and media outlets that receive more than 20% of their funding from abroad to register as quote unquote agents of foreign influence. Now, the move triggered angry protests, which was followed by police violence, and eventually the legislation was withdrawn. Turning to the Western Balkans, there is a lot going on there. North Macedonia and Montenegro both experienced acute political dysfunction during the year, but we saw their democracy scores move in opposite directions. And this was due to the improvements in local governance in North Macedonia, something that I'd like to highlight. Now, long-strained relations between Serbia and Kosovo have continued to undermine democratic progress in both countries, though in differing respects. Despite this challenge, Kosovo's civil society did manage to effect positive policy changes, such as their successful advocacy campaign that led the government to amend the criminal code to increase penalties for gender-based violence. And still, there is a through line that really connects this large and institutionally diverse group of countries, and that is Moscow's renewed invasion of Ukraine has made it clear that the EU is really the only viable option for political and economic solidarity in this region. And polling data bear this out, showing that a majority of citizens in these EU aspirant countries have a strong desire to achieve formal membership. And Ukraine, Moldova, and Bosnia and Herzegovina were all granted candidate status in 2022, while Kosovo officially submitted its application. Georgia was granted conditional status, but the events that I previously described are threatening that progress. But also, it's important to note that citizens in these countries, they're aware that this process of full membership can be long and complicated. And unlike in Ukraine, where the public's expectations for accession are quite high by 2030, years or even decades of waiting in the Western Balkans have left residents disillusioned about the possibility of membership in the short term. And for many in this area, the attraction of full membership in the EU is more about individual prosperity and the right to travel, work, study abroad, in other words, to leave their countries, than it is about the prospect of democratic progress at home. And so it's really incumbent upon the EU to reassess its approach and re-engage in good faith with these countries in the accession process. But at the same time, it's also necessary that national leaders in these places deliver the democratic progress for which so many of their citizens yearn. Lastly, we have the 8 consolidated authoritarian regimes in this report, where unrestrained state violence has become a distinguishing feature. And for the second year in a row, this category of semi-consolidated authoritarian regime has been left empty. It was once the second largest category in nations in transit. And the region's autocracies have steadily abandoned or crushed the various features that had previously mitigated the excesses of absolute power. In these, what were once semi-consolidated authoritarian regimes, you saw how they've slid into this consolidation. There used to be a degree of autonomy for local governments. There was a tiny core of independent journalists and civic activists. You had a genuine, if hemmed-in, opposition party, and there was limited space for some dissent within the ruling elite, but that has completely disappeared. The result has been a series of disastrous policy decisions that have taken people's lives and threatened some of these countries' very survival. Now, Nations in Transit 2023, it documented the largest single-year drop in Russia's score in the history of the report. There was a decline on 5 of the 7 thematic indicators here. In addition to the devastation that was caused by Russia's military in Ukraine, within Russia itself, authorities have adopted oppressive new laws, forced the few remaining independent media outlets and NGOs to close down or go into exile, and imposed heavy prison sentences on prominent dissidents like Vladimir Kara-Murza with his 25-year sentence recently, as well as ordinary citizens who just dared to express their opposition to the war. And then in the authoritarian states of Central Asia, we saw how internal developments rather than the regional conflict proved to be the key driver in a vicious circle of power concentration, dissent, and violent repression. As you see from this graphic here, this has followed a crude but simple pattern, which was visible throughout the region in 2022. From Kazakhstan's Bloody January to the brutal repression of local activists in Tajikistan's Gorno-Badakhshan region and Uzbekistan's Karakalpakstan region, Central Asia's authoritarian leaders utilized violence to punish discontent. And in all 3 cases, investigations into the violence have been quashed. Authorities have weaponized the judicial system to prosecute and silence those who have spoken out, and inadequate reforms have been introduced to mollify the public's anger. And all this does is lay the groundwork for fresh unrest. Now, this is a terrible story. And so I want to conclude with some recommendations for how we work together to roll back these authoritarian gains and revitalize democracy throughout this entire region. First and foremost, we must help Ukraine win. Defeating authoritarian aggression in Ukraine on Ukraine's terms is an imperative for the freedom and security of not only Ukraine, but Europe and of the entire world. A Ukrainian victory would do more for democracy in this region than any other single policy achievement we recommend. We must also renew commitments to democratic reform. This entails things like reinvigorating the EU accession process and related democratic benchmarks, particularly in the Western Balkans. And we must take decisive action to end attacks on democracy and the rule of law within the EU. And lastly, we must support human rights defenders. We could do this by providing financial aid and protection to frontline activists and journalists. We can do this by seeking accountability for human rights abuses. And I urge all of us here to continue to advocate for the immediate and unconditional release of political prisoners, of which there are countless in this region. Now, our report goes into more specifics on all these issues, but because we have such a stellar panel waiting in the wings, I will end there. Thank you for your time and interest in this report and for your support of our work at Freedom House.
Thank you, Mike. Really kudos to you and your team for putting this report together. Next up, we'll hear a panel of experts discuss the findings from the report, how some of these developments are being experienced on the ground by people and activists in these countries, and their implications for policymakers. So on that note, it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Paul Taylor. Paul is a senior fellow at Friends of Europe, an organization that is working to revitalize the European project and build a more inclusive, sustainable, and forward-thinking Europe. He's the author of their European Defense Cooperation Report series and was a longtime journalist for Political Europe. He previously spent 4 decades working as a journalist in Europe and the Middle East. Paul, thank you so much for joining us today. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Adrian. And thanks to Freedom House for giving me the honor of chairing this panel. We've got a great panel to discuss the findings of your report, Mike. And so joining you on the panel are Kurt Bassuener, who's co-founder and senior associate of the Democratization Policy Council, who has deep experience in the Western Balkans. We have Olga Onuch, who is a senior lecturer in politics at Manchester University in the UK, and a specialist on Ukraine, who recently published as co-author a book called The Zelensky Effect, which explores how Volodymyr Zelensky has leveraged Ukraine's collective history to create a pro-democracy, pro-EU national civic identity and try and unite his country. Zsuzsanna Szelenyi, forgive me for my Szelenyi, sorry, forgive me for my rough Hungarian, is a program director at the Democracy Institute Leadership Academy at the Central European University. And while the Central European University was forced to decamp from Budapest, she has remained there. She's also a former member of the Hungarian Parliament, one-time member of Viktor Orban's Fidesz party, but left it in '94 when it lurched to the right. And she's also the author of Tainted Democracy, Viktor Orban and the Subversion of Hungary. So lots to ask you. I think I detected several themes that run through this report, and I'd like to explore them. Let's start with 3. One is, I think, the dichotomy between, or tension between, stability on the one hand and democracy on the other, common theme across the region. Another is the tendency of Western governments to put geopolitical coalition building against Russia's invasion of Ukraine ahead of concerns about human rights and democracy. Perhaps a third strand is the subversion or perversion of democratic norms by liberal populist leaders within the EU itself. And we'll ask about that too. Can the battle still be won in Hungary and Poland? And if so, how? Well, let me start, if I may, with Kurt and with the Western Balkans, since in a way all three of my strands, I think, cross in your region. Kurt, first of all, what progress do you see, if any, in your region? And is the European Union putting geopolitics ahead of values in its new outreach, its new embrace of the region, the Western Balkans?
I don't see much progress at all. There are some caveats to that. I think the Kosovo government is trying, but it's facing a headwind, and a lot of that headwind is coming from us in the West, not just the European Union, but the United States too, as we saw in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee panel hearing with State Department officials last Thursday. Yes, all three of your questions come together in a storm in the Western Balkans, where if you talk to civic activists and values allies more broadly, they feel abandoned by the established democracies, actually worked against by the established democracies in their pursuit of, I wouldn't even call it stability, I'd call it pacification in the region. This works against what we say we're about. So it actually works in tandem with the local illiberals, the illiberals in the other illiberals in the region. So neighbors, I'm based in Sarajevo. I'm presently in Washington right now, but you have hegemonic agendas from Serbia and Croatia affecting Bosnia-Herzegovina, and there are other hegemonic agendas in the region. And then you have supporters of those hegemonic agendas who are namely in Budapest, but not just in Budapest, and supported effectively through EU institutions. The enlargement commissioner is Orban's guy, Oliver Varhelyi, and that affects the whole dynamic as well. So I think we're sort of pursuing a values-free geopolitics, which is completely contrary to our messaging when we're facing Ukraine. So you face this conundrum in the Western Balkans where the panoply and intersection of tools that were established after the wars in the 1990s, the final one that was in Macedonia just after that, was to prevent destabilization, threats to the peace, to enable democratic progress. And yet we're letting those who are the adversaries of democratic progress pursuing authoritarian consolidation. And as you said, Mike, these are all hybrid regimes by your taxonomy. We're effectively assisting their agendas, which assists, the geopolitical adversaries as well. I don't see how this hurts, for example. So it's a self-defeating policy, and it's hurting our credibility and driving migration.
So if I can pin you down on, are you saying that the argument, which has often been heard, especially since February 24th last year in Brussels, that, well, if we don't, energize the enlargement process and work with these governments, warts and all, then we will, they will be naturally pushed into the arms of the Kremlin or of Beijing? You think that's not true or exaggerated, or do you think?
I think that often is an excuse for doing what they were already doing before February 24th last year, which is collaborating with regimes like Alexander Vucic's, particularly fixated on negotiations over Kosovo. We're effectively squeezing the country that is moving forward the most by the Freedom House taxonomy, because it's the one over, they don't have anywhere else to go, while we're effectively appeasing the country where geopolitical arbitrage is the business model. And that's the business model for Viktor Orban as well. So I don't buy the argument that that we have to deal with these junkyard dogs on their terms. we have the effect, we have the ability to pin them down on our terms, because we have more leverage in the Western Balkans than anywhere else on earth if the West is together. And yet our policy is actually more against democratic change and democratic standards than it was 15 months ago today.
That's a grim conclusion. Olga, let me turn to you. Let's look at Ukraine. How has democracy performed during the war, in fact? Can you give us some examples? Some critics speak also of a worrying concentration of power around the president and his circle, which may be inevitable in wartime. How does it look to you? And is there a risk, as some people are seeing, of one oligarchy being replaced by another, by the manipulation of things like the Ukrainians' sanctions list?
Those are all great questions. And thank you so much for having me here. And I really enjoyed reading the report. Congratulations on that as well. Before I answer your question, this is very cheeky of me. I'd like to actually address this, how much Ukraine has moved according to the Freedom House Nations in Transit taxonomy since, let's say 2014, but really since 2016, 17, when we really saw a bulk of major reforms pushed through. It's moved very little. And I feel almost some of the things that we know today about the state of democratic governance in Ukraine, as well as the shift of civil society and ordinary citizens to liberal democratic positions, actually was happening at a little bit faster pace than the taxonomy captures perfectly. So I think that's an interesting question, specifically on areas in corruption, local governance, and governance more broadly. And I think the last thing many people know about developments in corruption reforms and addressing this, obviously a constant ongoing battle and certainly very difficult to continue during the wartime context. Local governance decentralization that has continued and deepened even during the wartime context. And in fact, we're seeing some of the very interesting political heroes are local mayors and local heads of councils, and they are doing actually a phenomenal job, and they were doing so from day one. Not something everyone expected. Very few people actually expected that to be happening in the southeast of Ukraine specifically. But this governance more broadly, I think what is interesting, what happened, especially after 2019, when Zelensky comes into power, is you have a continuity of the same reforms, even when they are against some of the entrenched interests of Zelensky and co. And we see that there is a continuation of these reforms and expansion of these reforms since February of last year, right? We see a further expansion of a variety of anti-oligarchic reforms that deal with corruption. We see that there is actually a quick turnaround, even in the wartime context, of figures that perhaps it is not convenient to get rid of at this time or to talk about their wrongdoings, but it is done so and done so swiftly. And that's something that we certainly did not expect to happen. And there is a little bit of tension between centralization, obviously, and local governance, but nonetheless, actors of local governance are given the freedom to do things on their own terms and actually lead on certain things. That is really important. That is perhaps surprising to those of us who studied Ukrainian democracy for many years. And that is obviously should not only be welcome, but by those who want to see further democratization in Ukraine, but also those who are worried about the state of democracy at wartime. Tensions exist. You have to centralize certain things in a wartime context. You have to have control over the information channels. I mean, that was certainly done to the media sector. We know that this is a very controversial issue. At the same time, this is a necessary evil, perhaps, in the at least immediate wartime context. Nonetheless, even with the centralization of media and journalism and so forth, there was immediate criticism, and it was publicly available, and it was even spoken by the journalists who are on the centralized media shows, right? They themselves were publicly condemning some of those actions. So I think that hasn't really gone away, even when it's been so heavily centralized. And the thing that I want to really point out here during wartime It's not so much the centralization versus decentralization and reform tensions. Reforms are continuing. Istanbul, in terms of civil society involvement in pushing that through, it was very much civil society helped lead that. The biggest tensions I see is discursively who is lifting up the state as the main actor of governance versus who is challenging the state. And if you, I'm not going to mention certain politicians here, but if you look at the discourses of certain politicians, they cannot challenge Zelensky because he is so well liked. So they challenge the state as not providing enough for the army, right? So paying attention to who's doing that, because challenging the state is problematic if you want deeper and better democracy. The state should be the central actor in the end of pursuing further democracy. Who is opposition in terms of the opposition has many non-democratic tendencies. Oftentimes we look at opposition forces as democratizing, as a normative thing. That is not necessarily the case here either, not least because some opposition parties are led by oligarchs, some of the biggest and most important ones historically, and that hasn't changed, and they have not reformed themselves. And I worry about next year, I worry about elections. As a scholar of democracy, elections we know, and certainly in the Freedom House and Nations in Transit methodology, this is such an integral part. Is it the right thing for democracy to hold elections in this time? Will they be divisive? Will the opposition use identity politics, challenging who is a good citizen, these sorts of things, or will they actually focus on policy? It's hard for them to focus on policy at this time because their policy area has shrunken. What was previously the opposition policy area is now no longer the opposition policy area, and they have to find a new space. Currently, the opposition has doubled down on things like supporting the army, on what it means to be a good citizen, and on anti-corruption rhetoric. We'll see how that ties together. That also can have the recipe of something else that we've seen in other neighboring countries.
Thank you very much. That's an awful lot packed into a short intervention there. So I'm going to move on to Zsuzsanna. We'll come back to you. And I also want to give Mike an opportunity when you come on to respond to the question of whether the Ukraine has been improving faster than the taxonomy has captured. But Zsuzsanna, I'm tempted to ask you, who's winning in the tug of war between Viktor Orban and the European Union, European Commission particularly? How effectively has Orban captured state institutions? How can they be uncaptured? Is the withholding of substantial European Union funds from Hungary and the economic pressure that that's brought about making a real impact on the rule of law situation? What more could, perhaps should, the European Union be doing to achieve results? And if I may, then I'll ask you a little bit about Poland afterwards.
Thank you very much. I join Olga. It's really a wonderful report, very nuanced, and I learned a lot about this. So the EU, first of all, I'd like to see that Orban is, so Hungary is the extreme of de-democratization in the region, but it's not the only one. And we can put Hungary and Poland on the table, but actually we have a lot of worrying signs in each and every country. So this is a process, and what Hungary offers to kind of to-be autocrats is a playbook. And many smaller and larger elements of such a playbook can be used by those who actually are living in proper democratic environment and slowly demolish, basics. And for example, one thing what almost everyone mentioned here is local authorities and the role and the competencies and finances of local competencies is one where I see everywhere in the region, even in the Czech Republic and Croatia and countries which are look fine. So it's a process, and I think this is why we really have to look each country. And of course, these processes in data is what this report is doing. So while there is no control over Viktor Orban's power within Hungary, it's a fully captured state. There are no limits from any other institutions. He's on power for 13 years now, and he made a largest victory last year. So this also demonstrates the longer autocratic political party remains on power, the more robust system they can develop. So it's get worse and worse, and obviously more difficult or more conflicting to ever change. So whether the EU is doing enough, I mean, the EU was really hesitant for many years, and this was only in 2020 under a major shock of the COVID-related economic crisis, when finally the EU really started to make a significant step and developed a conditionality mechanism for EU transfers provided member states. And Hungary is the first country where the EU is using this tool. But obviously there can be many others in the line, because all Eastern European countries abuse EU transfers smaller and larger scale. So the other shock experience of the European Union was obviously Russia's war against Ukraine, and this is definitely a transformative moment for Europe. And so far, EU is firm, and obviously countries like Hungary, which is still, Orban's government is still managing this tiptoe dancing between Russia and the European and Western governments, while being within the EU is seriously problematic for, I would say, Hungary and the region, and also for the European Union. So I think one thing what the EU should do is, first of all, maintain its firmness on the EU funds and develop this process further. Hungary is a guinea pig, and I think they can perfectionalize the process later. Obviously, keeping by Ukraine is an absolute necessity. I think most European leaders do know this, that this is a high stake issue, and also in terms of the state of democracy and the unity of the European Union is absolutely dependent. So I think there is an understanding of this. Whether there is also the political willingness is, of course, always a question, because there are malign forces within EU, because this kind of peace narrative that Orban developed is actually widely used among radical right parties. The Orban and some leaders are still quite successful in allying. I mean, they just organized the CPAC conference a couple of weeks ago in Budapest with Czech and Slovenian political leaders and Georgian political leaders speaking, and what linked them together also with kind of some of the American radical right speakers was this peace narrative. So systematically questioning the legitimacy, well, not openly, of Ukrainian independence and sovereignty, but basically using this easygoing narrative for peace, which in de facto means a support for Russia's propaganda. So I think there's a lot to do for the EU. It's absolutely not yet prepared for the accession for Eastern and the Western Balkan countries. The dilemmas you raised earlier with Kurt are absolutely there, and how the EU will be able to bring together geopolitical interests, which are high stake, and also the democracy, which also incredibly important, is a huge issue. And this is it because the autocratic forces, whether small or big, whether on power or not, they're all kind of bully forces. Their tool they use is kind of coercion if they are on power. It's smear campaign, it's nasty politics. So it's all about conflict. And obviously, this is something very different from the culture of the European Union, which the institution have to learn already now, and of course even more if it want to broaden its number of member states.
Well, obviously, one of the phenomena that's been created by Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine is a big divergence between Hungary and Poland, who were soulmates in the liberal corner of Europe. What opportunity does that provide? Because you get the feeling that they couldn't disagree more, basically, on support for Ukraine, taking in refugees, supporting sanctions, all of that sort of stuff. And yet, we haven't so far seen them really being split asunder on the illiberal agenda. Do you think there's a way that we can leverage that, or do you think it's just, they will continue to play both sides?
Well, I think, it's a serious conflict now, and the European Union is using this this opportunity that Poland, in many ways, is not standing by Budapest. For example, the opening of the conditionality mechanism, there was a need for Poland's support for this process. So it's there, but obviously there are various ways how Hungary and Poland, or I would better say Viktor Orban's government and Jaroslaw Kaczynski's government, are still on the same the same sheet, especially rule of law questions and many other issues. For example, putting this sovereignist vision for the future of the European Union, which is very blurry, but it's definitely against any kind of further unifying of the European Union, is the same with the two governments. And I'm talking about governments because obviously a change in Polish politics at the elections next October would probably change this. Another Polish government would probably represent a different issue in terms of rule of law, which would also be the case in Hungary if there would be any chance to change the government here. But Poland definitely has more chance because the ruling party, the ruling government, does not have the opportunity to change constitutional questions, election rules, and basically any kind of rules, which is a possibility for Viktor Orban's government. So there is a room for opportunity. A lot is depending on the outcome of the Polish elections.
Olga wants to add one word on Poland. It will be one line, and then we'll give Mike a chance to respond. And first to the question of Olga's question about whether Ukraine, like Wagner's music, is better than it sounds. And then I want to ask him a couple of questions about Central Asia, which we haven't got to yet. So Olga, one line.
I just we research Poland in our project, and my parents are former Polish diplomats. I should make that also clear. I think what is important for Poland this year is what happens in the next few months leading up to the election. They haven't had to pander to certain constituencies, and they were able to do certain things and put to the side some of their identity politics, some of their things around religious policy that also has affected both the judiciary and other laws. And I think in the coming months we will see if, in fact, Morawiecki, Duda, and others double down on the past politics, or if they continue actually some of with the new rhetoric that we've seen since February 2022.
Thanks, Mike. First of all, do you want to respond quickly to Olga's challenge on Ukraine and the taxonomy?
I would be happy to, and I don't think anybody here would be surprised that I probably agree with Olga more than I disagree. I think Nations in Transit historically has been a very conservative project, right? Not conservative, liberal, but very conservative in that it's very slow moving, and that we want to see not only that legislation is passed or that there's rhetoric showing that the institutions have improved, but that we want to see the results. We want to see that it has a noticeable and real impact on the democracy and how citizens experience it. And so I think that is perhaps one thing that's been keeping this score down. But I will say, I tend to agree with Olga. I think the institutions are functioning extremely well. We have many examples of that just in our own research on doing this. Our local researcher who conducted this, he was able to FOIA the Ukrainian government to ask them for the justification for some of their decisions during this war. Can you imagine that, being able to get a response from the government during wartime? I mean, that in and of itself shows that there is some measure of transparency and functioning governance during a wartime. I think that's really notable. And going forward, I'm feeling very optimistic about the status of Ukraine's democratic institutions.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting. And they're putting themselves under a lot of pressure, I think, by the degree to which they are pushing their European Union accession bid, because that forces them to actually make some of the changes that the EU requires. And they could do it at a slower pace and put less pressure on themselves. But of course, maybe they're hoping that the EU will turn a blind eye to some things because of the moral imperative to support Ukraine. But I hope that's not the case. Mike, let's look a little further east. In Central Asia and the Caucasus, we see perhaps two of those geopolitical phenomena I was talking about. We're seeing a weakening of Russia's grip because of the war, I think. Russia's distracted, and when the cat's away, the mice will play, not always to the benefit of human rights. And we're seeing efforts by both the European Union and China to draw these countries into their own orbit, and in the case of the Western side, to prevent them from helping the Russian war effort. What impact is all of this having on freedom and human rights across the region? Are there any bright spots that you can point to as well?
It's a great question, and I don't want to reject your notion outright. I think that there is a geopolitical component that is being played out in Central Asia with interest from Russia, with interest from China. But I think what the main driver of democratic decline in these regions, in these countries is really about the local agency of these countries and the decision-making of their authoritarian leaders, right? And that's one of the big conclusions this year, is that really the war didn't have as big of an impact in Central Asia on the democratic trajectory of these countries as I thought it might have. We thought that there would be, economic upheaval as a result of secondary impacts of sanctions on Russia. That hasn't happened to the degree that some expected. And really what's driving this democratic decline is much more of regime stability in each of these countries and the desire of these authoritarians to stay in power. We just saw this this month in Uzbekistan with the adoption of these constitutional amendments that would allow Mirziyoyev to stay as president until 2037. I mean, that is really what's driving this. And we saw this throughout the region with these local protests. We talk about this kind of vicious cycle in which these authoritarians have just garnered crazy amounts of wealth over years and vast amounts of power, which leads to discontent. We saw this in Kazakhstan. And then when they come out and protest, the regimes tend to view this as a threat to their stability and security. They don't care about addressing these grievances. They don't care about making people's lives better as they would in a democracy. And then this leads to repression and violence, which they are increasingly feeling very comfortable to use against their own citizens. They're really rejecting the basic purpose of a state, which is to provide safety and security for their citizens. They're the ones that are taking that away. And then they offer these little nuggets of fake freedoms. Oh, we have new Kazakhstan, we have new Uzbekistan, we're having elections, but really there's no opposition. Really, you have no choice in who's going to lead. And oh, we're not going to address these longstanding economic issues where we have stolen the state's money for our own kleptocratic needs for years. And so I don't want to shirk the blame onto the leaders in the Kremlin or in Beijing. This is really about what's happening in these countries and the demands of these people in these countries and asking for freedom and democracy.
So it's homemade, and I guess by extension, there's not that much that we in the West can influence.
I think I would disagree. I think there are things that can be done. I agree. It's a real challenge, right? Any kind of aid that you provide to people, there's the risk of perpetuating the autocracies. We see this in the Western Balkans, right? This is the whole stableocracy question, right? Of when you give aid, it just keeps these people in power longer because the discontent doesn't boil over, and thus they don't overthrow the regime. We're not talking about regime change, but what I think is still important is recognizing the human element of this, that there are people that are seeking just a better life in many of these countries. And so aid can be targeted at a very local individual level to address things like helping people, study abroad, or helping address local medical issues by getting them money to have better healthcare in some of these places. And yes, it's this delicate tension that I described, but I still have hope and think that there's work that can be done to make the situation better.
This is a big issue that I have also with EU assistance in general, including to member states, is that it goes through central governments largely, and it needs to be directed more at local governments who are much more varied. Kurt, you had a thought you put in the chat. If you'd like to express it to us orally, I think it's interesting.
Sure. I mean, there was a lot of, I think, understandable from a social sense, friction when Ukraine and Moldova became candidates in the Western Balkan Six. What about us, effectively? But the differentiation, I think, is what was reflected in the interchange between Olga and Mike on Ukraine and the methodology. It's a political will question. I mean, this door has been open in the Western Balkans for a very long time, really since 1999, when the Stability Pact and then Thessaloniki in 2003 formalized it in a different way. And that's that's the dark matter of the whole thing. That the whole point was enlargement was supposed to be a ladder and a lever for democratic progress and change. What we've seen instead in the region is the European Union, through its offices on the ground and through the mothership in Brussels and through a lot of the member states and associated countries like the United States, effectively granting indulgences to misbehavior and missing, avoiding standards and effectively rewarding misbehavior, and literally both financially, but also by legitimizing it, by still treating these guys as partners. And that's the differential. So I think that is actually quite instructive to values allies in the Western Balkans. The problem is they don't have friends on the outside who are willing to go to bat for them, and that's how they feel. I mean, my colleague Valerie Perry and I just did a road trip first half of March throughout the region, and the sense of abandonment and growing bitterness at a sense of, you guys talk about democracy and fighting corruption all the time, but when the chips are down, you care about lithium mines, you care about pacification, you care about recruiting workers for your demographic gaps, and geopolitical alignment, at least declaratively. And those are what your priorities are. And it's hard to argue against that because the evidence points in that direction.
Well, on that slightly depressing note, I really think we're over time. I should probably hand back to Adrian, otherwise he's going to fire me. But I want to thank all of our panelists for their contributions to a very stimulating discussion. Adrian, it's back to you.
Thank you so much, Paul. We have some questions from the audience that I'd like to get to. A few really interesting ones. A few that have been answered throughout the panel as well, on the role of the EU, on what's happening in Kazakhstan and Central Europe. There are two questions, one from Judith Chernansky and another from Arch Puddington, who's actually our senior scholar emeritus at Freedom House, that relate to Viktor Orban and the role of Fidesz both within Hungary but also within the EU. And the questions are related to, well, I guess the question directly on Orban is it possible to defeat Orban and similar autocrats given their tight control over the political message and their skillful use of the media to advance regime propaganda. There was a similar question around the role of propaganda coming in from Russia and pro-Russian propaganda, both within Hungary, and then the implications of Hungary holding the EU presidency in the next year. So I wondered, perhaps moving to Zsuzsanna first on this question, but also looking at this from a regional perspective, if other panelists would like to weigh in.
Okay, thank you. Well, so far it seems that it's not very easy. I think, as I said, the system is more robust. The resources are more related to the governing party. The rules of the elections are supposed to be changed again before the next year municipality and European elections, which has happened before each election in the last 12 years, which is absolutely nonsense. Yes, and of course the propaganda is just unbelievable, and there are various ways of propaganda. So it's a multi-channel propaganda, and it's interestingly the Ukraine, the pro-war or the Russian propaganda in Hungary is actually represented by certain actors within the national television. So it's not even Russia who should do it in Hungary, like in other Central European countries. We can monitor this, but in Hungary, it's within the state TV. And of course, there are pro-Ukrainian voices. The president of Hungary, Katalin Novak, is openly pro-Ukrainian. So this is a very sophisticated system, and it talks to different publics. So this is how Orbán reconstructs the majority, which is necessary for him which lasts from the extreme right voters and to a relative centrist, more conservative voters. So this is quite a fascinating thing. And well, at the moment, it doesn't seem to be easily, possible to break. I think the Turkish election result will tell a lot to us about how hybrid regime elections looks like when there are actually chances for the opposition. So it's really very disappointing. But Viktor Orbán told a couple of weeks ago to conservative journalists that when he spoke about Russia to them, he said that even manipulated elections can be lost. So yes, until there is always something to do.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to weigh in just from a regional perspective? I know that there was many other elections where some illiberal and populists were defeated at the polls.
Yeah, I'd be happy to jump in. We have this great essay in our report this year by Alexandra Karpy on this populist defeat in Slovenia with the defeat of Janez Janša and Andrej Babiš in Czechia being defeated earlier this year, and what that really means. And unfortunately, the news is not all good. It's great news for these institutions, but they've degraded the institutions for so long that in our report, it shows that it takes time to rebuild the degradation of and dismantling of many of these institutions. Janez Janša, for instance, took a hatchet to the state television in Slovenia, and it has not fully recovered from that. Even with a new government coming in, there's corruption issues. We just got news about these corruption issues that were going on between Serbia and Slovenia under the direction of Janša and Vučić. So I think there's some good news and some bad news, which tends to be the case of nations in transit every year. And we're we have to remember that there is a reason that these individuals won, right? There is a reason that this populist rhetoric has had an impact and it's won elections in some of these places, and that is not gone. And it's only going to be intensified by the impacts of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And so I'll come back to my main policy recommendation, which is help Ukraine win, because just from a purely selfish standpoint in some of these countries, Ukraine's victory will have positive economic consequences for many of these places. So even if you don't believe in democracy and democratic values, from a purely selfish point, you can argue that Ukraine's victory is necessary.
Thank you both. There's a question about term limits and whether this group thinks that term limits could be a good way to combat autocracy, particularly in Central Europe and Eastern Europe and Central and Eastern Europe and the Western Balkans. There's a point made that we see leaders who are on their third or fourth term and keep swapping between prime minister and presidency to stay in power for as long as possible. So I wondered, how do you see this topic of term limits fitting into democratic governance?
Just very quickly, I think I understand the impulse. I think the bigger problem, though, is if you don't deal with the underlying reason why these guys get traction and are able to consolidate, it sounds like an easy shortcut. What I would argue is for the established democracies that claim to want to support democratic change and have tools to do so, to actually walk the talk and call people like Vučić or Ban within the tent out on their abuse of power and leverage consequences. I mean, one of the biggest problems the EU has is all your leverage is at the front door, and once you're in, you could go off your democratic diet, if you will. And Croatia has done this as well, and there are many examples. And so the tendency to want to finesse things to keep it positive, to maintain momentum, actually works for consolidation of power. And I don't think term limits in themselves are a shortcut. And then you'd run into arguments over whether that reflects the will of the people and all that. We have the same arguments in America, as you know, and very rarely have they been adopted.
If I may just make a thought from my perspective, I live in France, and where we have a term limit, and because France is a consolidated democracy, everybody assumes that this is the president's last term, and everybody's conducting politics on that basis. But in somewhere like Hungary, well, we've just seen what we've just heard about Uzbekistan, where Mirziyoyev may be able to go on until 2037, by which time I will be dead and buried, probably. It's hard, you know, if you have term limits, only Democrats will respect them. And others will, you know, change the constitution to change the term limits when it suits them. So I wouldn't put great hope in that, frankly.
Maybe just one more sentence that in case of Hungary, which is a parliamentary system, so it's not very easy to apply in a parliamentary system where, you know, a majority of the parliament elects prime ministers, and in Hungary's case, also the president. So we have plenty of other problems with our constitutional system. And basically Hungary, political arena in Hungary is not that very different from our neighbors, but our constitution is very centralized and enables overpower very easily. So this is how Viktor Orbán got to power. And whenever we get there, we really have to make a more deeper constitutional reform.
Thanks, everyone. I wanted to bring in Olga on a question here on you, specifically on Ukraine. There's a question here. What do you think, just to put you on the spot, what do you think is the future of Ukrainian democracy? Do you think that the pathway looks similar or different to the path that was envisioned prior to February 24th, 2022? And just kind of one specific note on that, we often hear critics of Ukraine speak about it as a quote unquote corrupt country. And there was this event that the chief of the Ukrainian Supreme Court was detained on bribery charges last week. Is that a sign that Ukraine is corrupt, or is it a sign that its anti-corruption efforts are working?
Those are all different, difficult questions to answer, and talk about being put on the spot. And obviously, as a Ukrainian, I have also, as a researcher, this is very difficult for me. I have hopes, right? And I think all of us do have hopes that the democracy and democratization deepening continues in spite of the tragedy that has that Ukrainians have experienced. What I know for certain is that we missed a major democratizing moment after 2019 until 2022, and I started seeing it in my research as that final panel survey data started coming into us in February 16th, 2022, that people were moving en masse to pro-democratic positions, pro-Euro-Atlanticist positions, and that this was wholesale in Ukraine. I should note, though, we hadn't had a chance to say anything about Belarus here so far. The protests in 2020, our research as part of the Mobilize project also found that the major factor that motivated ordinary Belarusians to join the protests was a pro-EU position. Second was a pro-democracy position. So some of the similar dynamics happening amongst ordinary citizens in Belarus, seemingly, obviously very different reaction. So I know for certain we have had more democratization happening, and we have not been paying attention to it as well as possibly we could have at the ordinary citizen level. Those are the types of things we don't actually tend to track and trace as well as other things, yes? And then there's a dramatic shift, obviously, following February 24th. And there's a unity, there's a collective will to continue doing things. Certainly ordinary citizens across the whole of the country, 80% of the civilian population, our data shows, is engaged in the war effort. That is incredible. That is directly correlated to holding strong pro-democracy views and civic duty being very high at a personal level and holding pro-EU. So there's a lot of things happening here. What elites do in this context, how they get through the war, how they get through the next election, what discourses they use to maintain maybe this civic unity amongst the citizens and not double down on ethno-linguistic divisions that might still exist amongst them. These are questions to be asked, right? And the military is an incredible force. It's in part civilian. It's a civilian military, as it were. How politicians deal with that? Does the general become the politician later? At the same time that he is still a general? These are the questions for democracy scholars that I think are complex, and we can't possibly answer them. We see good things happening, but we also see potential alarm bells. So for me, when people suggest a general should become the president and run in the current elections, even that suggestion to me is odd. An active general, right? People that do not rally around the state, but rally around their own foundations to support the army and then create a glorification of the army as opposed to the whole of a united Ukrainian civilian effort. That is concerning to me. The centralization of power, the fact that there are shady figures in ministries of various kinds, the fact that they keep coming out into the public eye, but nonetheless, we sometimes don't know about them, like the most recent case, right? These are positive and yet worrying alarm bells at the same time. I am more hopeful than I am not, but I very much hope that the political elite of Ukraine continue to focus on liberal democratic discourses, on civic unity, on strengthening the state and state governance and state capacity to continue the reforms that are still, monolithic in nature. We already mentioned that. If Ukraine should continue on its accession to the EU, there is a lot to be done, not least win a war at the same time.
Thank you. I really appreciate you putting you on the spot there and sharing your insights with us. There's another question about perhaps local democratic governance. There's a question here about how we can strengthen democracy outside of the capitals and major metro areas in some of these countries and in the rural areas. I wondered if anybody on this panel can speak to any promising trends in that regard. Mike, and over to Kurt.
Yeah, I'll just say from nations in transit data, actually local democratic governance tends to be one of the most resilient indicators. It's where, when the national government has kind of been taken over by nepotism or kleptocracy or whatever kind of power grabbing we see in many of these countries, it's really local governance that is left to kind of clean up the mess in some of these places. And what we're really seeing in many countries, and I think Ukraine is probably the best example of this that I can think of, is the decentralization efforts have been noticed and they've been picked up by local citizens. And I would argue that the decentralization efforts are frankly like a part of the reason that Ukraine has been so successful in its defense as well, right? Of these local kind of governments becoming territorial defense units, which lets them to respond to challenges much quicker. And that in itself is, as Olga says, is creating more engagement with local communities. And I have high hopes that that will continue after the war is over, after Ukraine has won, and will continue to bolster this democratic civic identity that Ukrainians have really taken on. But I think the flip side is autocrats and wannabe autocrats recognize the threat of local governance. And so you see this in places like, as Zsuzsanna was saying, in Hungary, where there's like a constant centralization of power. And this has happened in Russia, frankly. Like this is what we saw over time, in which the national government has slowly stripped away any power of the local governments, and they've been subsumed in this power vertical controlled by the Kremlin. And so it's incumbent upon local actors to maintain their grasp on what kind of what sort of autonomy they have remaining.
Kurt, I saw your hand.
I'll be quick because I see everybody has something to say, which is good, because I think that shows that you hit a nerve, and this is a common thread. One of the issues, I mean, this is where there's local civic mobilization on environmental issues, which is a common thread in the Western Balkans and beyond. The problem is that the power map doesn't map onto that in terms of structural power. And the way democracies engage in these countries quite often reinforces centralization rather than supports decentralization and local initiative, and trying to structurally empower local communities, local self-governance, and just local initiative in general. So the impulse is there pretty much everywhere we went. We made sure that we got outside the capitals because we knew about that tendency, and that view was reinforced on our trip. The problem is quite often the way not just governments but donors engage with civil society and civic actors reinforces centralization for managerial simplicity and in a lot of cases, but also because for political reasons, and that makes it counter-cyclical and helps suppress that initiative when we should be trying to support it.
Olga, please.
Thank you, Adrian. I think the local governance, this is where I think I absolutely agree with you, Mike. This is where this is where democracy is not only, I think, nurtured, but made in a lot of cases. And if we look at even to the 1980s, 1990s, Poland mobilization, local mobilization at very, very local areas and local churches and councils, that was very powerful for changing the whole of society on board with Solidarność, of course. In local governance in Ukraine, there was a fear that it was a chance to actually capture some of the wealth and state now locally, and that it won't work in the way that at least the civil society actors and scholars would like it to. But what we certainly saw since 2014 is the areas that were able to make use of the decentralization reforms. We actually can monitor that those citizens are more trusting in government. Those citizens came to move to democracy at a faster pace because they saw that they wanted that bus stop right out of the local budget to be built, and they got it. And that was a very huge improvement on their daily lives, right? And seeing that the state works for you very directly can be very reassuring. And we certainly, I think we should talk about that difference here in places. In Belarus, we saw mobilization happening in a very dispersed geospatial manner. We know that there's local initiatives now happening. We're not actually able to study and capture that as well as we might like, because it's in Belarus during the war. But nonetheless, I think we should be looking for things happening there, local governance, not yet systemic changes, but civic, citizen initiated changes that might lead to bigger and better things. And when we look at Russia, we don't actually see a lot of this happening, either institutionally, so formally when it comes to the rules of the game, but also in terms of the local practices. And we see that that is very much stamped down, as was already said. And coming to this, I look at Poland and I look at the regional inequalities and the local inequalities that are being now experienced, specifically with the economic crisis and the influx of migrants to Poland, and how local policymakers are actually talking about that. And I find it's really problematic, right? And I'm worried actually that some of the local political actors in Poland are potentially the small roots of a liberalism in Poland and how they speak to their local constituencies.
Thank you. Zsuzsanna?
Yeah, local governance is in an absolute basics of democracy, and in the transition period, to provide competencies and finances to local government was actually one of the bases of building a democratic infrastructure. So it's, first of all, very, very important. Second, yes, it is absolutely possible to use it for organizational purposes, to create alternative political centers, let's say, against autocratic regimes. For example, or even in normal case, so for example, Fidesz party, Orbán's Fidesz, which was in opposition between 2002 and 2010, used, but was very present in local authorities. They were using very skillfully for gathering fundings and also reinforcing the party itself. So exactly, they know how important local authorities are, and this is why they are pushing down local authorities. And there is a heavy centralization is happening, actually, ever since the regime change. So the most competencies of municipalities in the region in Central and Eastern Europe were in the 90s. And whenever there is some problem, economic problem or whatever, governments like to pull away financial tools from the municipalities and centralize. So it's a general phenomena. And of course, in and let's say opportunity for levying various taxes, they centralize it. It happened a lot of cases during the COVID, and oftentimes they didn't give back these competencies. So it's again not only Hungary but many other countries who are using these little tricks. So I think this is something. Well, now the European Union, there is actually a strong lobby from cities to promise or to require part of the EU transfers significant funds to be distributed to cities and not through governments. But you can imagine that government also have to approve this, the 27. So it's really, there is a strong resistance. And there's also a problem of overviewing these funds. So the EU is just not equipped even to overview it transfers towards government. So how could it manage, to thousands little fundings to, compared to state funding to municipalities. So there's also a kind of institutional problem, but of course a political willingness.
I just want to turn it over, before we close up, I just wanted to turn it over to Paul to make a last comment.
Thanks, be very enriching. I'm tempted to quote a great American, the late House Speaker Tip O'Neill, or was it Majority Leader, who said that all politics is local. I think that localism is certainly one of the hopes, one of the last remaining hopes for democracy, where it is in big trouble at a national level. And it also, I think, is an opportunity to get over this sort of fragmentation of democracy that's happening in many places in Europe, which, the relevant level to people is still their local issues, their local mayor, and so on. When you look at, you know, in a crisis also, who's the first responder in wartime, whatever, the first responders are very often the local authorities, the mayor, the person who keeps the lights on, the water going, the buses running, and that sort of stuff. And so that's, I think, an area where I would like to see the European Union focus more. And I think perhaps Mike's report has given us some very good ammunition to make that case to the European Union. Thank you to everybody for an enlightening discussion.
Thank you, Paul, for making that call to action to finish us here today. So we're at the end of our time. I just wanted to thank Senior Director, Deputy Assistant Administrator Magno, all of our panelists, our wonderful moderator, and all of you around the world for attending today. I hope that you enjoyed the discussion, and I look forward to welcoming you back to Freedom House for future events as we continue this important discussion in the days and weeks to come. So thank you so much. Bye.